By 1271, Kublai Khan had crowned himself the Emperor of China, ruling over a domain that stretched from the Pacific Ocean to the edges of Europe. In his hands lay not only armies of horsemen, but something far more dangerous, the first empire-wide experiment in paper money. It was called Chow, a simple note backed by silver and gold. At its peak in 1287, it powered trade across the Silk Road worth more than any network in human history. But within less than a century, it would help destroy the empire that created it. The hidden truth is this: the Mongol Empire didn't collapse because of swords or plagues alone. It collapsed because its money died because trust, the invisible empire, dissolved. To understand why, we need to go back in time. Imagine the world in the mid-13th century. The Mongols had unified lands that had never spoken to one another before. From Baghdad to Beijing, trade flowed like blood through newly opened arteries. Caravans carried silk, spices, and silver under the watchful protection of Mongol patrols. For the first time in centuries, a merchant could travel from Venice to China using a single currency, the emperor's promise written on paper. But beneath the prosperity, something fragile was forming. Each new campaign demanded more soldiers, more grain, more horses, and more notes. The yuan treasury, once backed by solid silver reserves, began issuing new bills not tied to real metal. Prices started to shift. Confidence began to flicker. What began as a brilliant financial invention would soon become a trap. When paper replaced silver and trust replaced metal, the Mongols created a system that no army could defend. And the moment that trust cracked, the empire's fortune turned to dust. To see how the greatest military power of its age was undone by its own money, we have to trace the empire's wealth back to the first printed note that promised the world, and the quiet inflation that destroyed it. The year is 1260. The Mongol Empire stands as the largest land empire in history, but military conquest alone can't hold an empire this vast together. Roads, tribute, and trade have to move faster than rebellion, and money, real or imagined, is the key. When Kublai Khan seized power and established the Yuan dynasty in 1271, he inherited more than the Mongol legacy. He inherited China's financial system, one already familiar with paper money since the Song dynasty's Jiaozi notes 2 centuries earlier, but Kublai took that experiment and made it imperial. He unified the empire's currencies, banned local coinage, and issued Chow, the first government-backed paper money that stretched across continents. The turning point was coming. The empire that once ruled by sword was now ruled by promises. And soon, those promises would be broken. Each note bore his seal and a warning in red ink: those who counterfeit will be decapitated. It was legal tender in every corner of the empire, from the Persian markets of Tabriz to the ports of Quanzhou. A merchant could buy spices in India and pay with paper printed in Beijing. At first, it worked beautifully. The Mongols controlled the Silk Road, secured by military outposts called yam stations, where couriers carried trade and intelligence faster than any kingdom had seen. With silver and gold reserves from conquered lands, the paper notes were convertible, backed by hard metal, and trusted. Marco Polo, visiting around 1275, marveled that the Great Khan causes the bark of trees to pass for money. He couldn't believe that people accepted mere paper as wealth. But the secret was force and faith, the 2 pillars that make any currency real. As long as the emperor's power was unquestioned, the notes held value. Yet the seeds of collapse were already sown. Empire-wide administration was expensive. Vast building projects in Dadu, modern Beijing, the Grand Canal extensions, and failed naval expeditions began to drain silver reserves. The yuan treasury printed more notes, each one promising metal it no longer fully possessed. In 1274, Kublai launched his first invasion of Japan, a massive fleet of 23,000 troops. The cost was staggering. When the mission failed, the treasury covered the losses not with silver, but with new paper. The second invasion, in 1281, doubled the spending and ended in disaster again. Each storm that wrecked the Mongol ships tore a hole in the empire's balance sheet. Still, the illusion of prosperity held. Trade boomed, cities glittered. But the foundation monetary trust had begun to erode. The farther you went from the capital, the more merchants began to demand silver instead of notes. By the 1280s, the Mongol treasury was running on promises it could no longer keep. The silver that once anchored every Chow note had been drained by war, corruption, and imperial vanity. When Kublai Khan's fleets sank beneath the typhoons of Japan, his money began to sink too. In 1287, the Yuan court tried to restore order by introducing a new issue of notes, the Zhongtong Chow. Old bills had to be exchanged for new ones at a fraction of their face value. It was, in modern terms, a forced devaluation. The empire's citizens were told that the new paper would be backed by fresh reserves of silver and silk, but the vaults were nearly empty. Merchants were the first to see the danger. Prices for grain doubled in a few years. In the markets of Khanbalik, modern Beijing sellers demanded silver instead of paper. The once mighty Silk Road slowed. Traders who had crossed deserts now hoarded metal in hidden chests. Then came the spiral. To pay soldiers and fund distant garrisons, the Yuan government printed more notes. Inflation exploded. Local officials, desperate for revenue, issued their own regional currencies, chaotic, competing, and worthless outside their provinces. By the early 1300s, reports tell of peasants dragging sacks of paper to buy a single bolt of cloth. A state once bound by horsemen was now torn apart by its money. When the plague swept through Asia and reached the empire's heartlands, the economy was already bleeding. Trade collapsed, tax collection failed, and banditry surged. By 1351, the Red Turban Rebellion erupted, a movement of desperate farmers and disillusioned soldiers, united by one belief, that heaven had withdrawn its mandate from the Yuan. In 1368, the Mongol capital fell to Zhu Yuanzhang, the founder of the Ming dynasty. The conquerors of the world fled north, their empire undone not by enemies, but by debt. The world saw only the fall of a dynasty. But beneath the surface, it was something else, the first global financial collapse, a fiat implosion centuries before the word even existed. The world thought it was plague and rebellion, but the true assassin was invisible, born from broken promises, multiplied in ink, and sealed with the emperor's stamp. The fall of the Mongols was not sudden. It was engineered by their own invention. When Kublai's government tied the empire's economy to paper money, it built a system that thrived only as long as people believed in convertibility. At first, every note could be exchanged for silver or gold. That link was sacred, but by 1287, as military costs devoured reserves, the court quietly suspended full redemption. The paper stayed in circulation, but the promise of metal behind it vanished. This was the pivot, the invisible moment when trust turned into illusion. Once the chow became unbacked, the government had discovered a dangerous magic. Wealth could be created with ink. The temptation was irresistible. Whenever war, famine, or imperial projects demanded money, the answer was the printing block. By the early 1300s, officials were printing multiple note series, Ji Yuan Chao, Ji Zheng Chao, each new issue devaluing the last. Merchants understood before anyone else. They stopped lending, trade caravans shrank, the Silk Road, once a living artery of silver and goods, began to die. Without metallic backing, the paper no longer moved between regions. It became provincial, local, useless. And then came the contagion. As each province began issuing its own money, a system built on unity fractured. Inflation became regional. Markets collapsed in waves. Taxes paid in paper couldn't buy grain for the army. The Mongols' military machine, dependent on supply routes, financed by credit, stalled. The soldiers who once carried the emperor's banners now carried worthless notes. It's a pattern we've seen before. The Roman denarius, debased until silver vanished from its core. The French assignat, printed to fund revolution until it bought nothing but bread. The Weimar mark, collapsing under war reparations and overprinting. Each time, the same mechanism. Convertibility lost, trust broken, collapse inevitable. The Mongols were the first to run the experiment at global scale. Their empire functioned like an ancient reserve system. Their paper was accepted from Baghdad to Korea as long as it was trusted. When that trust died, the world's first integrated economy disintegrated. The Mongols believed their empire was eternal. Every dynasty does. When Kublai Khan printed paper money, he thought he had discovered a miracle, the power to create wealth without metal. But what he created was a time bomb. The notes that once united the empire became its poison, dissolving the very trust that held it together. Centuries later, the same pattern repeats. The assignats of revolutionary France, printed to fund liberty, collapsed into chaos by 1796. The Weimar Republic's mark lost all value by 1923, when a loaf of bread cost billions. In each case, it was never the paper itself that failed. It was belief, the invisible gold behind every promise. Today, the symbols are digital, not printed. The ink has turned into code, yet the principle is unchanged. Currencies are backed not by metal, but by faith. Faith in governments, banks, and systems too vast to imagine failing. And just like in 1287, the illusion works perfectly. Until it doesn't,